Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Sandra Visser about Anselm's views of human and divine freedom.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Sandra Visser, who's professor of philosophy at Hope College. Sandra works on topics in metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of religion, with a particular focus on the figure that we will talk about in the interview today, namely Anselm of Canterbury. Sandra wrote the chapter on Anselm for the Routledge Companion to Free Will, and she's also the co-author with Thomas Williams of a book called Anselm, which was published in 2008 by Oxford University Press in their Great Medieval Thinkers series. Thanks for joining us, Sandra. Welcome to the show. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy at Hope College. I got my PhD from Syracuse, started out in economics, which is relevant to why I'm interested in free will. And my work is, as you've said, metaphysical questions, but especially interested in free will, both in the medieval period and all times and all problems concerning free will.
Mm-hmm.
I spend a lot of my life thinking about those things. What else did you know? How did I become interested? I don't actually think there was a time when I wasn't interested. I know certainly I was interested in junior high.
Wow.
It is the one thing that gave me a career shift. I started my PhD in economics. I was partway through my master's in economics. I saw there was a free will class in a philosophy department. And at that time, I was bored with my economics classes. So I took that, and they switched my fellowship over from the econ department to the philosophy department, and the rest is history.
Yeah, nice.
That's cool.
So was Peter Van Inwagen still at Syracuse when you were there?
Yep, he was.
Nice.
Yeah, I knew nothing about philosophy, so I did my master's degree, and my advisor it was at Northern Illinois. He said, I think you'd really like Syracuse. I'm like, okay. And they gave me a fellowship, so I'm like, I'll go here. Yeah, so Peter Van Inwagen was there. So I'm sure that solidified it. But
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
that'll
Yeah,
do
that
it.
was a powerhouse department for a while.
yeah, I was there when it was a powerhouse department. It was really fun.
Yeah, nice. Well, longtime listeners of the podcast will have heard of Anselm, especially in our interview with Catherine Rogers in the series on freedom and foreknowledge. But could you start by giving us a bit of historical context for the discussion? When did he live? What philosophers was he influenced by? What are some of his most widely read texts, or any other background that you think might be helpful?
Sure. So Anselm's dates are 1033 to 1109. He was born in Aosta, fought with his father, and then sort of wandered around Normandy for a while and ended up at the Abbey at Bec, where he studied under Lanfranc, who was a powerhouse at the time. One wonders if Anselm hadn't gone to Bec, if it would be Lanfranc that we were discussing right now. He just got overshadowed by Anselm, who was his student. It's from Lanfranc that he learned the dialectic, and from there on he argued pretty consistently about everything. That is to say, his philosophy was through argument at that point. He was at the Abbey for a good deal of his career. That's also where he taught. That's really obvious in his writings. He's really responsive to his students. He talks to his students. You can use some of his dialogues in the classroom today, and the students ask pretty similar questions to the ones he's responding to. So he's really responsive to his audience in a way that some other philosophers aren't. And you'll notice his mode of writing shifts as he goes to England and becomes archbishop. He went to England not to become archbishop, did not want to become archbishop. There's a famous painting of him trying to refuse to become archbishop, and it did have a deleterious effect on his ability to write and think about philosophy. Probably his happier times after he became Archbishop of Canterbury were when he'd get exiled by the king. Like he'd plead with the Pope, "Can I please stay in exile?" And the Pope would come back to England.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
His influences, Lanfranc, obviously, and of course Augustine was a mandatory influence for everybody, but you can see it throughout his works. So those are his primary influences, sort of philosophically. Intellectually, you can see him responding to the people around him a lot. And it's relevant that he was a monk that deeply shaped how he saw the world and sort of how he talked about his ethical positions.
Anselm has what might seem like a strange and non-standard understanding of free will, and it might take some discussion of other issues to fully understand his definition. But could we start with that? What is Anselm's definition of free will?
His definition is the power to preserve uprightness of will for its own sake. And obviously, to our ears, surprisingly teleological discussion of what free will consists in.
Yeah.
Um, so it's teleological. And here, excuse me, this isn't so odd for his time, right? He deeply thinks that God made us for a reason, and he thinks that everything he did for a reason, and he gave us wills for a reason. So to figure out how to will or what a free will is, we have to look at what's going on and what it's for. And once we figure out what it's for, right, then we can figure out what it is. And so what it's for is preserving justice for its own sake. That is being good. I mean, roughly speaking, right? Being good for the sake of being good. Not unfamiliar if you're thinking about like what Aristotle would say a moral action was, but since that's the goal of what human beings are for, obviously God would have given us a faculty in order to do just that. And so he's got an unusually teleological view of free will.
Yeah. Well, you note that one starting point for thinking about free will is the problem of evil. So, how does Anselm wrestle with this problem? How does it affect what he says about free will?
Well, the question always arises, and Anselm's not unique in this regard. The question always arises is if God is good and God is perfect, where do we get evil? Where
Right.
does it come from? And of course, and so we're going to have to take all our goodness, right? We can't have any evil. God can't put any evil in the world. So where does evil come from? And it's a pretty standard, right? Why do we sin? Where does the sin come from? How
Mhm.
come we can't stop it? And how is it possible that it's our fault? So Anselm's right. This isn't surprising. You'll hear echoes of Augustine in this, and Anselm's answers mirror Augustine's answers, but he's a little bit more specific when he talks about how the will plays a role into it. Augustine kind of just says, say in the Confessions, it's just humans' fault
Mhm.
because they've become disordered. Anselm wants to put a little more flesh on that and explain how the disorder occurs and how to think about this disorder. And so his question of free will, so his answer to the question, he's mainly thinking about moral problems,
Mhm.
the moral issues of free will. When he's talking about evil, because the other evil stuff, he's strictly Augustinian. It's some sort of disorder. So in terms of yeah, so he's coming from the problem of evil to say whose fault is it and how to get there, and of course it has to be our fault.
Mhm. Well, we want to ask specifically about Anselm's view that the human will has two distinct inclinations or drives, one for happiness and the other for justice. Could you explain these inclinations and how they relate to Anselm's views about sin and about human freedom?
Sure. So Anselm first wants to say, well, in order for sin to be our fault, it has to be something that we initiate ourselves. So he thinks of God's act. So he says there's God's activity, and we can't, right? If God is acting through us or on us directly, then our action won't be free. He thinks that there's natural action in the world. Those would be things like from the laws of nature,
Hmm.
right? And everything would come from us. But our nature itself might incline us to act. But if our nature inclines us to act in only one way, like a horse's or a dog's, right? No free will there. So, because what we're looking for is self-initiated action. It's a parallel way that he talks about free will in human beings. Anyway, so
Hmm.
we have this power for self-initiated action, but if we only have one will, whatever it would be the will that God gave us, and if there were only one will, then we would be willing out of necessity, so sin would be God's fault, not
Mhm.
ours. So he says there must be two wills, and they both have to be good wills. So we have a will for justice and we have a will for happiness, both of which are good. But we can see as we're rational people that justice is better than happiness. And so our job is to act in such a way that that if we think justice and happiness come into conflict, we'll always will justice. So the reason we need two wills and the reason it's these two is to enable us to be able to self initiate so that any action that's self initiated is ours. And if we only had one will, that'd be God, not us. If we have two wills and we're deciding which will to follow, then any sin, which he talks about in On the Fall of the Devil, right? Any sin is picking happiness over justice. So this seems like you have to have at least options in order
Mhm.
on Anselm's theory of free will. He doesn't he thinks that's necessary for humans because we're creatures,
Mhm.
right? So that we're created. So if we were only given one will, once again it'd go back to God, so we need to have two. In God's case, God can self-initiate any of his action, and so he's not right. He's dependent on himself for all of his actions, so he doesn't have a alternative possibilities issue. But we need alternative possibilities at least once. But once we will in accordance with one of our wills, let's say it's a good person, not me, right? And I will for justice, and I stay just once I've willed for justice, I don't need a second will because now I'm preserving justice for its own sake from my first
Mhm.
action.
When it comes to explaining sin based on this will for happiness, does Anselm? So I'm thinking of two different ways of cashing this out. One way would be like a Socratic way, like we make mistakes about what will actually make us happy. And then there's another way of thinking about it where no, we actually really want those bad things. And it's not so much a mistake, it's more of like a weakness of will or something like that.
Yep. Anselm's not a huge fan of weakness of will. He doesn't think that our desires can ever overcome our will because that would he doesn't say it explicitly, but he talks a lot about weakness of wills, and he says that's just a really bad excuse. God
Yeah.
has given us a will such that it's powerful enough to overcome any temptation. So he thinks that what happens in the fall, once again, it's the fall of the devil that and so he's talking about the fall of the angels, but it works the same way for humans, right? He's saying so they have this desire for justice, they have this desire for happiness. They see a good thing that they don't have, but they want. And they know so their desire has to be for something good. It can't be for something bad because right, we're in a pre-fallen state. So they see this good thing that they want and they think that so they will for happiness there. They don't trust that God will give them whatever they wanted if they just will justice that the happiness will follow. They become impatient and they will directly for happiness.
Hmm.
And so they've willed for happiness over justice. And that's this is actually one of the reasons that the good angels don't fall is now they see and so God gives them all the happiness that they had wanted in the first place. He gives that to them so that there's nothing more good that they could possibly want. It was just that one outlying good. And they're confirmed in their goodness because now they're absolutely sure, after seeing the example of the fallen angels, that willing justice is the only way to yield happiness.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So for us, it's the same way, right?
Hmm.
We're tempted. We know what the right thing to do is. He wants to make sure that this one isn't like we're confused about picking justice over happiness.
Right.
It's just our unwillingness to wait and trust that we're going to get all the happiness we could desire by willing justice.
Yeah. So it's more about like the ordering of the will. It's like
It's,
we.
right, really Augustinian. It's the ordering
Hmm.
of the will. We know, and Anselm is really clear. We know what that ordering is. We know we should preserve justice. And you hear a little Aristotle too, right? Whom
Hmm.
we did read a little bit, right? You see that you have to will the right thing for the right reasons. And my reason has to be I can't be aiming for happiness. I've got to be aiming for justice or
Yeah.
righteousness, right? We can translate those
Hmm.
equivalently for him.
Hmm. Well, this leads right into our next question about his definition of free will. So why does he think that free will is the power to preserve justice rather than just acting justly or out of justice or something else?
Yeah, he, well, first, it's going to be a power to preserve because what do you have that you haven't received? So you've received a will, and your will is perfect. So you're just preserving. So any act you do, you don't have anything that you. I just said this, but I have to say it again, right? You don't have
Mhm.
anything that you haven't received. So you don't have like your own justice to be acting out of.
Mm-hmm.
It's preserving the justice. You've been given a perfect will. You're maximally just, and so you're preserving it for its own sake. So there's acting out of like motivated by justice. I mean, those could be equivalent. It could be that, well, let me just ask. I know this is probably supposed to just go one way, but I'll send it back to you. So, what do you mean by, which I have been wondering, is what do you mean by acting out of justice? I mean, acting consistently with justice, preserving the goodness of my will seems equivalent to acting out of justice to me.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe like being motivated to do what's just or something. Maybe that could be one sense of out of justice.
Yeah, so I think that and that's consistent with what he's doing.
Yeah.
By preserving justice, that just is, I'm going to do whatever's just. And he has a remarkably simplistic, in a non pejorative way,
Mm-hmm.
uh, simplistic view of how easy it is for us to tell what's just. He just thinks it's obvious what justice consists in. And so you're motivated to preserve justice. That is, you're motivated to be just. Because
Mhm.
if you do something that's not being just, then you're failing and you're picking something else, which would be acting in all this language. I think it's all equivalent language. He just uses a language that's unfamiliar to us.
Mm-hmm.
Preserving justice just means you're being motivated by your will for justice and you're just going to do what justice demands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's roughly the same thing.
Yeah, that answers the question that I would have, or the way I would have put it is, if you think about just merely acting in a just way, and maybe you don't really want to, or you have alternate motivations, but you just happen to act justly, versus you're being motivated to act in the right way for the right reasons and the right timing.
Right. Yep. And so that's why it's you preserving justice for its own sake. That is to say, you're acting justly because it's just. You're being good because it's good because you want to be good, not because you want to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Happiness is a bonus, but
Right.
it can't be a motivational force.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. That's helpful, especially. I mean, you mentioned the line, "What do you have that you did not receive?" Which I'm guessing he's getting from Augustine's emphasis on that reading of that verse from the New Testament. But it does emphasize there's a kind of reliance or dependence on something that you've received from God, in even the view of what it is to act justly or be
Right.
properly motivated. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which ties into to some of these other issues. It's you
Hmm.
receive it in the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Anselm is perhaps best known in philosophy for his ontological argument for God's existence. And part of his reasoning relies on the idea of God being that than which a greater cannot be thought. How does Anselm's view that God is a perfect being relate to his views about God's freedom? And are there any differences on his view between God's freedom and human freedom?
Yeah, so Anselm also thinks it's really easy to tell which characteristics are great making or perfect making
Hmm.
characteristics, and one of those is to be able to act freely. And so of course God can act freely.
Yeah.
But for him, remember when you're saying of course God can act freely, that doesn't mean of course God has choices. What it means is of course God has the power for self-initiated action.
Mhm.
And so when you're thinking of freedom that way, it's almost trivially true that God is free because a being that couldn't self-initiate all of his or her action or its action or whatever the case may be, right? If you don't self-initiate any of your action, it looks like you could be better. So when you're thinking of freedom as self-initiated action, of course God has self-initiated action. He's not God's not reactive. God doesn't find out, right? Anselm's really strong on God's aseity. That is that everything comes from God and comes from Himself. So free will is something, or freedom is something that God's going to obviously have.
Mhm.
It looks like, or you might think that God's free will is a little bit different than our free will, because in our case, remember, we had to have the two wills so that at least
Mhm.
once we had to have at least options
Mhm.
in order to be free. But remember, that's also to preserve. But when you remember that it was to preserve our ability to have self-initiated action, otherwise it would have been God's activity. You
Right.
can see that for Anselm doesn't think God needs alternative possibilities, only creatures. And only creatures need it because they've got to have two wills so that they can't blame everything on God, or that it's not God's responsibility. But God can God will self-initiate any action that God has, and it will be consistent with his nature. But since his nature comes from himself and everything that he has comes from himself, God will have free will, even if there are things that we think God can't do. And Anselm spends a lot of time saying, well, what do we mean when we say God can't do something? And then his analysis is always, well, when we look at what we say that God can't do, what we really mean is that God basically wouldn't want to do it. It's not even a thing to do because
Mhm.
it's less perfect than he already is, right? Why would God want to, right, lie? We say God can't lie, but when we look at what's happening, God would be being deceptive, which would be unrighteous, which would be not worthy of him. And so it's not a thing that would be less of a thing or less of an activity. And it would be disorderly, so that wouldn't be godlike. So that's not going to be one of the options. So even though God can't, in our sort of common parlance, do some things, Anselm doesn't think that that's at all a problem, because everything he's doing is absolutely the best. And if you're seeking for perfection all the time, there's frequently only one option. Um,
Mhm.
Right.
and so, but the power for self-initiated action, or the power to preserve justice for its own sake, that's exactly the same for God as it is for us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So he can speak univocally of God's freedom. He's a big univocal speaker. He generally thinks that our language about God is univocal with our language about that we use for ourselves.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting. Given his understanding of sin, Anselm thinks that human beings today cannot help but sin without divine grace. So how does divine grace work on Anselm's view? Does it make possible any growth in character for human beings?
Yeah, it interestingly does. So this comes from De Concordia, where he explicitly talks about the interaction between grace and free will. And he just says, first he says the Bible is misleading because sometimes it makes it sound like it's all free will, and sometimes it makes it sound like it's all grace, and that's just a misreading because the authors they were doing whatever they were doing, but these things come together. Before I launch into the actual answer to your question, I also want to say that Anselm's pretty clear and he's pretty clear, he says it several times, that the sort of free will he's talking about whenever he writes about free will is the free will necessary for salvation,
Mhm.
not sort of your garden variety, I'm living in a fallen world free will. Because then things get so messed up in terms of our wills. Although
Mhm.
he still talks about it, and he thinks there's that kind of garden variety free will, but it's not really that interesting to him. So when we come back to free will that's necessary for salvation, that's why grace is so important. So what happens is, he's like, is it all grace? Is it all free will? He says, no, it's both, and this is how Anselm works it out. He says, and this is his example for the people who like the actual text, right? He says it's like when you give a beggar clothes, so that's what the grace is like, right? You give the beggar the clothes, but then it's up to the beggar to put them on. So God, through grace, in the first instance, unmerited grace, will give us an upright will, and it's up to us to preserve the uprightness of the will, so that the grace never is going to direct what it is that we do. He just gives us the starting point. And as a Benedictine monk, he thinks that we can fall and then we need more grace, right? Lots of conversions, continuous conversions for Benedictine monks. So he thinks that this could happen lots and lots and lots of times. So we fall, we don't preserve the uprightness of our will. We pray, God gives us unmeritedly more grace. Our will is upright, and then it's up to us to preserve our uprightness of will. Now, as to the growth question, if we preserve uprightness of will, then we will deserve more grace, and our will become even more just. So the first one is unmerited. He doesn't want to be a Pelagian, but once we're in the sanctification realm, if that's a clear distinction, we can become more and more just by preserving justice, because what we're aiming for in this degreed thing comes much later in his work, in his writing, and he doesn't really say much about it, because you think that uprightness of will is kind of a toggle on and off, and that's how he tends to talk about it, except in De Concordia, where he seems to say, well, you can become more and more just, and what we're looking for is a perfectly just will, right? No hints of going for happiness over justice, so that you can get better and better, and you can do good things that merit God granting you even more grace, so that you can become more just.
That's interesting. So, what can interfere or get in the way with that process of becoming more deserving of more grace later on? Is it the kind of, giving up on the will for justice that you've been given, or, something to do with this conversion that happens, kind of falling away from it?
Yeah, it's those free, and he thinks we do this all the time, right? We just choose happiness over justice, and you do that once. As soon as you do that, you can't regain justice. Once you've lost justice, because it has to be granted to you, and you can't sort of like gin it up, because it's an entirely separate will, and we can't perfect our own natures. We're just not those sorts of creatures. So once you pick happiness over justice, when you should have picked justice, then you're just on your own. And so he doesn't, in my theory, I have no reason other than to watch reading his letters, he's not as much of a virtue ethicist as you tend to frequently get by some of the medievals. And I think, and as a personal opinion, I think it's really because when you watch the sorts of letters he has to write, because he's the abbot at Bec, and then he becomes an archbishop. So he's really familiar with people's sins. And he had some, and you can see in his letters where he's really sad, because he'll be talking about some monks who became alcoholics. Not an uncommon problem when the monks that ran the wine cellars would occasionally become alcoholics. And so what he sees are people who are alcoholics, and they're habituating, and then they're tempted just that one time, and then it's just all over. It's not like a steady, it's just like you've fallen off a cliff.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't think you can sort of work your way up and down. He's like, well, he's just fallen, and now he's going to need God's grace to become, to be able to even preserve uprightness of the will for its own sake.
Yeah. So on the converse side, once you have received God's grace and you're acting justly, is your continued action of justice, does that require God's grace too, or is that done through your own free will?
No, you're preserving it, right? That's what God gives you, is the ability to preserve things, right?
Okay.
We can't gin them up out of nothing, but he's given us wills that we can preserve. So our job is to preserve, and we can become better and better and more just by just regularly preserving. Because when you fall in one area and you've lost your uprightness of a will, how good your will is seems to be a matter of degree. He's just not very clear on that bit. But yeah, so then you've got the power to preserve justice. That's actually why, which is something you didn't ask about, and I'll just free bonus material. There's this question about sin, right? Is the power to sin part of the power of free will? And he's like, no, because having the power to sin would be a bad thing. But you sin through your will, so your will your will is doing the sorts of things it's supposed to do. It wills things. But your free will is the power to preserve justice. Your will itself, right? So there's no power to sin in your will. but you can misuse your will. It will be doing what it's designed to do, which is will, but you'll will say happiness over justice, and that's what sin is. It's using your will to will things, but not to will in virtue of which it's free. Our wills are free in virtue of the fact that we can will justice over happiness. So when you're willing sin, you're not using the free portion of your will, right, which is to will justice. You're just willing, that is motivating yourself to act. Is that clear enough?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we talked with Jesse Konoven about Augustine, we saw that he reads Augustine as having a very normative conception of freedom or of free will. And it seems like Anselm is in a similar vein, where it's not so much that the freedom is a metaphysical kind of freedom. It's more about being free to do the right sorts of things. Although there is there are some,
There's some metaphysical things, right? He wants it to be self-initiated action, right? Sounds like an agency. Like today, we'd say he's an agency theorist, probably, right? So he wants that because he's worried. He's not a compatibilist. He's really worried about. He thinks it's preposterous that anybody thinks that if you're doing something because it's your nature, or if you're doing something because there's a law of nature, he's like, that's just preposterous, that would be free, right? So but he doesn't want your will to be entirely random, although he calls it spontaneous action, right? So he wants it to be yours. He doesn't want it to just be, right, some sort of physical. He doesn't have the laws of nature like we do, but he doesn't want it to be something outside of yourself.
Right.
So he doesn't want it to be arbitrary. He certainly doesn't want it to be a feature of sort of causality. So it's got to be that self-initiation that he's looking for. And normative, because he has to follow Augustine. When he doesn't, he does get in trouble by Lanfranc once, and then he just never asked Lanfranc to read any more of his stuff. He's like, hey, this is great. And he goes, it looks like you're going beyond Augustine. He goes, no. So then when he writes to the Pope, he's always like, this is what Augustine would have written had he had enough time. So it's a great line.
Yeah.
One of his letters that's one of his cover letters. But I can't remember. I've lost all track. What were we?
It was normative, like Augustine.
That's normative. Absolutely. Yeah. It's that you've got a will. It's got to be for something, and it's got to be for something good.
Right.
So that disorder can be your answer to everything.
Right. That's great.
So he's not a compatibilist, so he's an incompatibilist, and that's why compatibilists wouldn't like him. But he's an incompatibilist as an agency theorist, so somebody like Van Inwagen also wouldn't like him because he finds agency theory mysterious. Anselm thinks that it's not mysterious because he's not asking sort of the same sort of fine-grained questions, but he thinks it obviously has to be yours or it doesn't make any sense, right? Especially since it's all aimed sort of at salvation.
Yeah.
Which he thinks is really the only point, right? You're asking about sin, you get the fall, you've got reconciliation, you've got heaven, right? When you're in this heavily Christian mindset, it actually makes complete sense that it would be normative when you're that deeply Christian. We don't live in a Christian age, so we think, oh, these just arose from chance. So it sounds funny to us, but actually in a lot of our ways because we want to do what we want to do. But notice we actually build in a certain normativity. It's just sort of idiosyncratic normativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If the norm comes from outside you, it makes complete sense that you'd have this teleological view.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That is helpful. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Sandra. This has been great. We were talking off before the recording about how you didn't have very much of an online presence. We normally ask people, where can listeners go to follow your work? We can link your faculty page. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug?
That would be thrilling for your viewers. They're like, wow, I wonder if she has ever actually updated this for your listeners. So your listeners can do old school Googling and look at an old webpage at my current institution of higher learning.
There you go.
Yeah. All right.
Love it.
Yeah. Thanks again, Sandra.
Yep. Thanks, you guys. It was fun.
Our next episode will focus on Thomas Aquinas, and our guest will be Harm Goris, Assistant Professor of Dogmatic Theology at Tilburg University.